Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is Kushalmehra. All right, today we're going to talk about a book, and this time it's a good thing that we're talking about a book written in Canada. The book is called Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. I have the author of the book with me here, Tristin Hopper. Tristin, welcome.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. And if there's banging in the background, it's definitely not because there's a toddler wandering around. Just a ghost.
Well, we should get him on the podcast someday.
It's right here. If you like seeing children, then here it is right there.
Right. Oh, it's her. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. That's nice. All right. So I want to start first because this is a question. I like to ask this question to every author that I cover on the podcast. This podcast covers a lot of books. I have a habit of reading 40 to 50 books every year, and I cover a lot of books on the podcast. So why did you choose to write this book, and were there any specific reasons? And also, this is your first time on the podcast, so can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Tristin Hopper. I'm a reporter and columnist for the National Post. This is my first book. And what inspired me to read it was I've worked for the National Post, right here, National Post, since 2011. And one of the things I have done since then to sort of look around for story ideas is to just sort of have an idea of how the international press is covering Canada. So just go into Google News, set up a VPN so you're in various countries other than Canada and search the word Canada. See when the word Canada or Canadian is being mentioned in foreign news stories. And one thing I've noticed is that when I started doing this, you would usually only see Canada mentioned in the context of something quirky, or it was usually something we were doing well. So they'd say, if you want to run an immigration system, look at the Canadian immigration system, points-based immigration system. It's a high immigration country. There's no sort of mainstream anti-immigration sentiment the way you would find in the United States or in Europe. Or if you want to get out of the sovereign debt crisis, do what Canada did in the 1990s. If you want to get through the global, the Great Recession, Canada did the best of anybody in 2008. In 2014, Canada had the world's richest middle class. I could go on. Whenever I saw Canada mentioned abroad, I would say, oh, good, that's us. We're doing well. And then in the past 4 or 5 years, that sort of started to slow down and change dramatically to the point where whenever I see Canada mentioned, in Indian media, in UK media, in French media, in American media, it's usually because we're an example of what not to do. So a great example of that is we brought in the online harms bill. This is just a few months ago, and this got international coverage because in the democratic world, this went further than almost any other piece of legislation in terms of controlling speech. This is the infamous, I saw this covered everywhere. This was the one where it prescribed preliminary detention in cases where someone was suspected that they may actually go online, say something hateful online. So this was the so-called pre-crime bill. And you also see it in our approach to medical assistance in dying. You'll see it in terms of healthcare shortages. So it was me noticing that trend of not only was I noticing that Canada seemed to be deficient in all of these areas, but the rest of the world was as well.
Do you think a lot of this, as far as coverage of Canada is concerned, was that Canada was in the eyes? So I'll explain with my story, right? I was born and raised in Mumbai, went to Canada, studied in 2001, came back, got married to a Canadian in 2007. I did not move to Canada even then. I got the Canadian to India. And I only, because of a personal family tragedy, decided to move half of, or more than slightly half of the year to Canada in 2022. And that's when I would follow Canadian news, but I can actually relate to the idea of, oh, Canada, we have the best healthcare. Oh, Canada, we when the banks collapsed, we did not collapse. One of the biggest reasons Indians were very attracted to Canada is because it had a similar system to India in terms of the banks are very conservative, they're very risk averse. Canadian banks are very risk averse, and Indian
Yes.
banking is very similar. and those are few reasons that I would remember that they're just like us in that sense. And obviously the parliamentary system, and I mean it's slightly different, the parliamentary system in Canada compared to India, but there are similarities. But what exactly happened? Like, how could things go so wrong in terms of perception management? I get policy decisions are wrong, but there's something that the political class of Canada would manage in perception management. But forget the India Canada relation that has gone completely downhill in the
Oh
last
yeah.
5 to 7 years. Forget that. I don't want to make this about India Canada, because it's about your book and it's about the image of Canada in general. But Canada has had bad relations with all countries now. It's not one country. Like it would be an aberration if Canada had bad relations with India. They have bad relations with everyone.
Yeah, bad relations. Foreign affairs are a mess, and what I cover in the book is just many issues at once are quite bad. So it would be one thing. I probably wouldn't have written a book if it was just one thing that we were sort of the worst in the world in. But it was me noticing that all about at the same time, a bunch of sort of issues coalesced. And it was surprising to me as a Canadian, because you grow up with it. We have the greatest healthcare system. We are the world's most low corruption country. I mean, they tell us in school, I'm sure they do this in a lot of countries, but you are the luckiest people in the world to live in Canada. And I do feel lucky to be a Canadian. But it's shocking to me when I look at sort of global rankings of, say, healthcare beds, ICU beds per capita, and we're at the bottom of the OECD. When we have the highest fatal overdose rate of any other sovereign nation. Scotland is slightly higher for now, but they're part of the UK. That we have the world's most unaffordable real estate in terms of income to price. So all of these metrics at once are not only bad, but they are uniquely bad. And I only put a chapter in on a subject if I could prove that Canada was uniquely bad. So you're not going to find a chapter about, like, we ran up a lot of debt, or, we really weren't great at military spending, or military was weak, we can't defend ourselves, because those are common things across the West. A lot of other countries did that. But I only sort of looked at if Canada had gone further than anyone else and had the worst metrics and was very much an outlier as compared to the rest of the world, which again is very shocking when you tell Canadians that there is something we're doing wrong that no one else is doing, and frankly thinks we're kind of weird for doing.
Now, I want to talk about the first chapter of your book. That is the bit I want to read the title: "The Easiest Country to Get Euthanasia." So my background is philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm a student of philosophy. Now, there's the one thing that I got attracted to Canada about was that Canada allows euthanasia. Actually, um, one of the reasons that attracted me was that, let's say, if tomorrow, if I become physically impaired and I believe that this existence of mine is not worth it in my eyes, in my assessment, as long as I'm calling the shots, then I like the idea of a country which allows euthanasia. Now, there are religious connotations to this. I'm an atheist, but I come from a country where actually, the idea of giving up your life is very normal. In different, Indian religions, whether it's Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, uh, I not so much in Sikhism, but the other three, there is
Yes.
this concept of giving up your life, because life is cyclical in Indian
Oh
religions,
yeah.
right? You're
Yeah.
born again. It's cyclical, and so they say, oh, we're just leaving this body, we're going to come in another body. So it's
Right.
there. So I found it very fascinating that a Western country um, allowed euthanasia, but the way you've explained it, it doesn't sound that great.
I think, well, the majority opinion in Canada, so sort of the 80-20 issue, 80% of Canadians think the way you think, where if I am in chronic pain, terminal illness, because basically everyone I know, I'm not sure about you, but everyone I know has had a parent or an aging relative who gets a degenerative disease, and just, it's Alzheimer's, and it's just a real hard road for those last 10 years. They don't know where they are. They're scared. And, it's just forever. Quality of life is dipping. And I think everyone has sort of seen that and said, there's no way in hell that's going to be me. I want a way to sort of, so I think it was a very popular issue in Canada to sort of have that option to legally sort of punch out early. So I don't think that's controversial. But what is controversial about it is the way we implemented such a system, because there's about a dozen countries around the world who have done, they call it assisted dying, they call it legal euthanasia, we call it medical assistance in dying. But when Canada brought in its system, we had people coming in from other countries that already had this, Belgium, the Netherlands, and they said, well, first of all, you got to be real careful with your checks on this, because this opens a whole can of worms. You can't just legalize assisted suicide and expect that it's going to go exactly the way you intend. This is one of those things where there are massive unintended consequences. And when you look at the origins of how we brought in our system, there was basically no imagination whatsoever that it could go off the rails, that there could be unintended consequences, that there could be bad actors. And it's actually shocking knowing what we know now. And what we know now is that Canada has had the world's fastest growing rate of assisted suicides, way faster than we assumed. We thought it was going to peter out at 2% of deaths. And within 3 years, it was 4% of deaths, and it's growing by 30% every year. And we don't see any sign of stopping. So, I mean, it could peter out at 10%. We don't have regional data because the data collection on this sucks. But in certain regions of Canada, it could be as high as 15, 20%. I've heard rumors, I'm in Vancouver Island, that it is up to 1/5 of all deaths are assisted suicide. On top of that, you have all of these scandals, the most egregious of which was an instance where this is a veteran who was calling Veterans Affairs with PTSD, soliciting help for it, and in response was offered medical assistance in dying and took it. So you actually had, and so there's that, and there's just any number of these scandals. And it used to be Belgium and the Netherlands who were sort of furnishing these scandals. And Canada, it's just been dozens of those, one after the other. Now, when you look at the origins of how our system was brought into being, you'll even see it because it was legalized by a Supreme Court decision. They essentially found that it was a charter right. And it's weird when you parse the actual decision because they say Canadians' right to life guarantees a right to death. And there's sort of this very convoluted way in which they decide that. But at the end of the court decision, I mean, there was any number of experts, in this Supreme Court hearing who said, you should be careful about checks. You can't make this a hard right. You've got to have sort of barriers in place. You have to have independent agencies. And they said, we don't need to worry about any of that. And I'm forgetting the exact line, but they said, we cannot lightly assume that this is going to go wrong. So it's just this sort of arrogance that we're Canadians. We know what we're doing. We don't have corruption like other countries. We don't have bad actors like other countries. If we do it, it's going to work well. And thus, we have the world's most low barrier assisted suicide system, and it's acted as you would assume. It's gone in a whole bunch of directions we didn't anticipate because those checks weren't there. And this is sort of a theme throughout the book. It's just this naivete that, we're Canadians, we've been well managed, we're different than other people, we don't have to worry about the problems that plague other countries. And thus, when a bad piece of policy, when a bad idea comes, we do not have the skepticism to stop it. We had zero defenses against it. So it hit us harder than anyone else.
Do you think the solution lies more in policy correction than junking the policy all by itself? Because if I was looking at it, if people are being pushed towards euthanasia at an alarming rate, or if people are picking euthanasia at an alarming rate, those are two very different scenarios, right?
Oh, yeah.
The latter is a mental health crisis in the country, a loneliness crisis in the country, and the former would be a government system that is just not able to deal with senior care. It is starved for resources. I mean, I'm just looking at the primary reasons that cause the secondary effect, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a secondary effect. What is the primary reason? That's what we should try to dissect when we're doing policy analysis as far as Canada is concerned, right?
I think it's I sort of get into this in the chapter, but just sort of stopping that egregious growth of MAID is actually pretty simple because you just look at what they do in other countries, and they have two basic checks that we never even considered. One easy one is this is what's done in the United States. First of all, you have to be terminally ill to qualify for MAID. So Canada did get rid of that with a court decision. We initially had that because I think we correctly saw that that was a very good way to sort of prevent it from, extending to you have someone deciding that it's poverty is sort of an egregious factor enough for someone to qualify for MAID. So if you look at the United States, you can't, in the states that have it, you can't qualify for assisted suicide unless you can administer it yourself. And it's just a small change like that. But they sort of avoided, first of all, the rapid growth and also a lot of these sort of scandal edge cases that we have gotten. Just a simple check or fix like that. Another very big one, and this is where Canada is different than any other system which does this. In most countries, the idea of a physician recommending assisted suicide unsolicited, so saying, have you considered this? That's illegal. They can actually lose their license for doing that because, as you can imagine, it completely changes the dynamic of how you're interacting with your doctor. You're in the hospital. You think you're going to get better. A doctor comes in. You're vulnerable. You don't know anywhere to go. And a doctor suddenly, out of the blue, mentions, have you thought about killing yourself? And then, that sends you for a whole kind of a loop. Under the Canadian MAID guidelines, doctors are supposed to do that. They are instructed not assume that someone already knows about assisted suicide, and it's seen as part of the continuum of care. It's seen as no different than any other palliative care, and that's the way it should be treated. That's real weird. No one else around the world treats it like this. This is seen as sort of a civil rights issue. It's important that we have it, but it's something that exists outside the medical system. There's a very hard.
So the state is not supposed to nudge you towards it. The state is there that if you want to do it, the state's like, okay, we'll help you.
That's right. Yes, and if it is suggested, there are criminal penalties in some cases for doing that. Versus in Canada, where every doctor has read guidelines saying if someone's in pain, just bring it up. Maybe not pressure them. But you can imagine there are any number of cases that have come to light where people have been pressured because it's quite a can of worms. And when you mix legal assisted dying with an overburdened healthcare system, again, it's baffling to go back to the origins of this policy, and no one thought, and even if they were warned about it, they thought these two things were not going to intersect. We've got a crazy overburdened healthcare system, doctors being run off their feet, and then here's a cure. It works 100% of the time. Death, cures all, and there's no way to tell that you made a mistake.
It's because somebody just in the live stream wrote, well, there's no PTSD once you're dead. So, and that's it.
Yeah, the treatment worked. They are successfully dead at the end of it. So it's sort of a good example. And with something, it's interesting you mentioned that, there is widespread support for a basic option to punch out.
Yeah, I'm one of them.
Point.
I'm one of them. I support
and
this.
That's the vast majority of Canadians. And then under that rubric, that's something that everybody agrees with, is all of this sort of mismanagement and unintended consequences that happen very quickly, because this has only been legal, really at a large scale since 2018. So we went from no assisted suicide to the most assisted suicides per capita of any other country on earth, in weird categories and with extremely low barriers. Most places you need at least 2 doctors. There are independent verifications. There's a complaint process. None of that exists in Canada.
I'll give you an idea of how it happens in one community in India. For example, the Jain community. That actually the Jains practice this the most. They call the word in Sanskrit or Prakrit in their language is called santara. Mm-hmm. Basically giving up your life willingly when you realize that I have done my bit, I have taken care of my family, I have done all my duties diligently towards my family, my society, towards my dharma, and now it is my time to leave. And then what they do is they slowly reduce the intake of food. So I'll give you the whole process of how it happens.
Oh, sure.
But before they decide to take a santara, it's not just the willingness or the decision of the individual who has decided to take the santara. Is a long discussion where you have to first sit with the family, consult with the family. If the family disapproves, they don't do it. It's it's a very, very different system, and the government is not at all involved in it.
Right.
That's the weird thing. The government is not involved. Now the Indian government has tried to make it harder, that nobody just, because what if people start killing their parents for property disputes or something of that sort. So the Indian government
Right.
is trying to make it harder, but it still happens in the Jain community especially, and there are media articles in India talk about this all the time. But what they do is, the community is so robust that it's not so easy also to do the process of Santara in India as a Jain. It's because the community is so involved in each other's lives.
Right.
And it's actually a very unique system. I was raised in a majority Jain area, while I was a Hindu growing up, and there was just Jains around me. I mean, there's barely any difference between Hindus and Jains other than a few beliefs here and there. They're all Indian religions. But it is very fascinating to me how the community input in the Jain system is so high that they do, they what you call the free rider problem in a purely evolutionary term.
Right.
They
Right.
they thought of a free rider problem, and here I think what Canada is going through is actually, the free rider in this case is the state itself. It's free riding, and it's pushing people into something that they should not be doing. The state's job is to, don't end your life. That should be the reaction of the state. The state's reaction should not be, hey, why have you considered killing yourself?
Yes. And I think when Canadians hear that that's what's happening, and it's often sort of hard of Canadians to sort of accept that this is happening. I mean, even just doing interviews for this book, if it's with a radio station, often the host will be getting comments, people calling in and saying, "You shouldn't be speaking to this Tristin Hopper with his Canada bashing book, very unpatriotic." That he would come in and trash this country. We are at existential threat from U.S. President Donald Trump, and we must be united. And I would argue the exact opposite. I think a lot of these problems actually got worse in the world because of that willingness to just have blinders on and not see something. And any number of times in this book, I bring up instances, whether it's a failure of the criminal justice system, whether it's a failure of the assisted suicide system, whether it's some real wacky policy in terms of gender identity. Policies that the exact same thing has been tried in other countries and was extremely controversial. And it happens in Canada, and no one knows it's happening. And if they do, they just kind of move on with their lives. So just this continual thing where something will happen that I'll think, maybe this will move the needle. Maybe the veteran killing himself after being recommended by Veterans Affairs, this is going to be the point at which we say no more, and there will be a piece of legislation put in place to sort of check it. And that just doesn't happen. So I've come to think it's just, we have most of our lives grown up in a country that was functioning quite well. And we just got used to the idea that prosperity, good management, good governance, peace, all of these things were things we didn't have to worry about like the rest of the world. This was just going to be our birthright forever. And there was nothing we had to do to maintain it. So very similar to, you move into a house and don't do any maintenance, and then one day the ceiling collapses from termite rot, and it's quite shocking when that happens.
Do you think it was inevitable, or it was the doing of the politics of Justin Trudeau along with Jagmeet Singh? Because a lot of times I wondered myself, like, because I've lived in different Canadas, right? The Canada I first lived in 2001 and 2 was a very different Canada.
Oh, that was peak Canada.
Yeah, so that was really nice.
Mhm.
And that was the time I went back to India, and I did not stay in Canada, and I chose to come back to a Canada which is kind of going down. And the thing is, for me, when I look at it, right, I think it's very funny, since Donald Trump has become president of the United States of America and he started the 51st state joke again. It's only then that the Canadian liberals, and I'm saying this, these are my words, these are not Tristan's words, before people like, this is, look, I have no political party in Canada. Let me put it this way, right? I'm a landed immigrant. I can't even vote in the Canadian election. I just look at the Canadian system sometimes as an insider outsider, right? I look at it, and I see that the Canadian left was unpatriotic as hell until Donald Trump happened. And then suddenly, I see Canadian flags everywhere in areas I never saw Canadian flags. I would see Canadian flags in usually conservative leaning belts. That's where I would see Canadian flags.
Right.
So that's the pattern. I'm saying this is the pattern I've observed in my life in Canada. And now suddenly, I think the Canadian left a significant part of their identity was we're not America. I just think that's their identity. We're not America.
Oh, I think that's the identity of Canada, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that identity. I can get into the ways in which we are different, and there's much more depth to the country than just not being American. But I mean, if you look at the origins of Canada, it's various waves of people who they were creating a country that was going to be across the continent, and we had a different idea of how to put together a country across the continent, and it was a race to the Pacific Ocean to see whose vision of the country could maintain itself. So I think it's actually triumphant that you have the United States of America, the most powerful nation that has ever existed, who had no problem taking territory from anybody surrounding it. And we were able to capture a big chunk of that continent and keep it, sovereign to a different country under a queen. So I think that definition of Canada is fine. So, from all the way back from the Loyalists who escaped the American Revolution to Sitting Bull, sort of after the Battle of Bighorn, hiding out in Canada. So I think that is a strong part of identity. But I forget where I was going with this.
No, but I want to talk about the next bit in that identity politics. Now, obviously, you've used other examples in identity politics in Canada. You've spoken about the indigenous past of Canada and many other things that you talk about. You obviously you balance it out with the American example of the African American experience in America, and you talk about shoddy scholarship in Canada. I think I remember reading Jonathan Kay's work also on the mass graves recently, and how they never found mass graves, and nobody in Canada seems to talk about bad scholarship can lead to bad outcomes. Now, like when we talk about identity politics is a human universal, because while we have secularized ourselves enough globally to think that individual rights are the primary basis of our existence, at our evolutionary existence, we're all group rights obsessed or duties obsessed people.
Mm-hmm.
Our group identities come up, and identity politics is an attempt to hack that evolutionary imprint on us. I've always said that identity politics looks at the evolutionary nature and says it's easier to get group votes, so let's play identity politics. And do you think self-flagellation is a very important marker in Canadian identity politics?
It would be hard to argue against that, because there's certainly been a lot of self-flagellation. So the example of, everybody's flying flags around. This has all been very surreal for me. Because it was only 2 years ago. They haven't rescinded this. We are still the world's only state that has declared itself guilty of an ongoing genocide. That's something that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said. It's not like Mark Carney stood up and said, "Oh, okay, we were overreacting a bit." It's weird to go from this is literally a horrible genocide state to let's wave the flag around. These seem to be mixed messages to me, and something again you don't really see in any other country. Identity politics. That's one of those things I think Canadians find most shocking when they find, how intensely that has been absorbed into our institutions and in our government. So I've heard from multiple people who they'll be applying for a research grant, they'll be applying for a government job, and what is now standard protocol now for any of those, any grant that receives government money, you have to fill out sort of an identity form at the end where you're listing your background, your identity, your race, the background, race, and identity of everybody on your team. And people who are not used to this are shocked by it. They're saying, this is Canada. We were born and we were raised to, you treat people as individuals. You do not see them as ethnic groups, different colors, different religions. The whole point of this is that we don't do that in Canada. So before they see it, they think it's illegal. I'll often see comments on my stories when I write about this. They'll say, this is illegal. You can't treat people different based on race. You can't hire differently based on race, which isn't true, because it is encoded into law. So I break it down in the book. There's any number of quite shocking documents to read, in which the one I always go back to is this was the Canadian Armed Forces Anti-Racism Report. And there's a line in there in which they say they just fully adopt US imported ideas of anti-racism. And this is basically the idea that everything is sort of systems of oppression. There are oppressed, if you're doing well, you're an oppressor. If you're doing poorly, you're an oppressed person. And it buys into that wholly. And you see within a Canadian Armed Forces government document signed off by the defense team, sort of, senior leadership of the military, saying that racism is the system in Canada. All of our institutions are sort of systemically racist. And it's so racist, the only way we can get out of it is race-focused policy going the other direction. Just identifying these marginalized races and giving, special treatment to them because the existing system is so racist. Now, this is the military. You're asking people to take a bullet for the maple leaf, while also telling them, oh, by the way, the maple leaf represents a fundamentally racist, horrible genocide system. Good luck in Latvia, holding the line for NATO.
Yeah, I don't think they thought of it like that. It's for me, what again, you might disagree with me. I think the essence of Canadian politics is self-flagellation. And the essence of Canadian politics, and this comes from my observation because again, I live both. I go to America a lot of time. I have family in America, I have family in Canada. So the Americans come off as a bully at times in the North American existence and the relationship overall in North America. And the Americans are very confident about themselves and their place in the world and the place in the globe. Canadians start with "we're not America." And then I think it's a lot of catching up to do as far as attention seeking is concerned. I don't know why the Canadians decided to start getting attention in all the bad things. And it stems from, we have to convince ourselves we're not America. And if we are something, we're better than them. It's a very warped mentality that the Canadian, I'm not talking about the average Canadian I'm talking about the Canadian political class.
And it's very toxic because, if we're going to talk about healthcare, the Canadian healthcare system has gotten very, very bad in the past few years. And I think there's been any number of necessary reforms. I think if the U.S. system wasn't there's any number of times where, as early as the 1990s, we're starting to see shortages, we're starting to see chronic failures. And whenever there's, simple fixes suggested for our system, it's always just, okay, well, you want to be the United States? Someone breaks their leg and ends up with a $50,000 medical bill. No, we are the best system in the world because we always just compared ourselves to the United States. And I think that's also true of the overdose crisis. We just say, well, maybe we're doing slightly better than the Americans. We're slightly more enlightened on these issues than them. So there's actually quite a lot of issues in which, say, the United States is worst in the world, and then Canada is like second worst. And that's very much by design because we're like, oh, okay, well, as long as we're better than the Americans, screw them, greatest country on earth, Maple Leaf forever. So it's sort of for both systems because we've got the worst, and I can argue why. I think we've got the worst iteration of a socialized healthcare system. And the United States, in very many ways, has sort of the worst iteration of a private-based healthcare system. So it's two extremes staring across a border at each other, and they don't pursue any reforms because they're just looking in the mirror at, the worst case scenario of what could be. So nothing changes.
Yeah. And on the identity politics bit, like what's happening in Canada right now in the last year or so, where every weekend is a protest weekend. It's just, for an average person who lives in Canada, irrespective of their identity, I think and you know what the problem is? The Canadian, the average Canadian is so nice, and see this niceness, it spreads too, and being nice creates self-censorship.
Oh yeah,
and people are not saying the quiet part out loud. You can sense it. When you talk to people.
I've heard the difference. Yeah, Americans are friendly and we're nice, and there's advantages to being friendly because the friendly person is more likely to tell you the truth. Niceness can have sort of a chill behind it. Someone who's overly nice to you but is quietly judging you. That's not a great feeling. So I can certainly understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. If I'm sitting at a cafe and if you go to your local cafe, you end up bumping into the same faces, even though
Mhm.
you're not friends with them. You talk to them, right?
Yeah.
They're your local cafe members as such. So you're just going having conversations with them, and I would just say the quiet part out loud. I would be like, "Am I the only one who's fed up of protests every weekend, irrespective of whether I support them or I oppose them?" Right? It's like an odd days. It's the Palestinian group. Even days, it is the Khalistani. I'm just saying the quiet part out loud. I
Yeah.
just say it, and you're everybody around me, especially white people. Then they're like, "Ah, at least the brown guy said it." It's so weird. I'm
You
like,
can say
no,
whatever you
it
want. You could go on
yeah,
some weird, anti-Sunni rant, and no one's going to stop you. They'll just get more and more uncomfortable.
yeah,
Um,
and it's just weird for me. I'm like, listen, I was like, I'm not talking about something alien. I'm just saying that how much longer is this gonna last? Like, I need to get to work. That's all I'm talking about. I need to
so
get
yeah,
to work.
there's certainly a dark side to being nice, because sometimes if someone keeps getting out of prison and molesting children again, you have to not be nice to that person and potentially put them in jail for an extended period of time where they can't hurt any more children. And the protest example being a great example. I mean, I'm in BC, so we've had. If you'll remember, you mentioned Khalistan and Palestine. When you remember the events of Freedom Convoy, I'm not sure what your listeners think of Freedom Convoy, but the
No,
rest
no,
of the
I've
world,
covered it extensively.
was kind of laughing at us. Like France, there was an attempted Freedom Convoy, and they're like, "Hey, we're France. We know how to deal with protests. We just had police checkpoints. We've got our, city Paris Metropolitan Police bulldozer, which I can't think of any Canadian police force that has a liveried bulldozer on hand." And they're like, "We just set up bulldozers at the highways coming into Paris, and if they tried the trucker thing, we hit them with the bulldozer. We arrested them, maced them, and this was never a problem for us." So this idea that you just let in 100 truckers into the core of your downtown and let them sit there and take their tires off, what's wrong with you? So yeah, it certainly was a weak moment. I can't think of any other countries who were so easily taken over by such an obviously disruptive protest.
Now, just a question. I know immigration is mentioned, but don't you think the one thing Canada got right, it got right so well that
Mm.
that is the one thing I would always say. The Americans, like, I remember my wife always being like, "Why are you so pro Canada?" And I would be like, "They got immigration right. They did not do a little too much of it. They had that perfect trickle down immigration system where they just let X number of people
Mm.
and then
Yes.
they blend into Canadian society, and that's fine." And I was proven wrong by the politicians even on that one. And now my wife actually mocks me for that. She's like, "It's on you. You're the
it's
one
it's
who
been a, it's
jinxed
been
it."
a heartbreaking 10 years for me, because I was aware, I was a lot appreciative of what Canada did well, and I sort of knew what it was doing well. So in immigration, yeah, I would have gladly told anybody who asked. We innovated that, the idea of a points-based immigration system. At
It's
the
so
time
good.
Canada thought of it, most people, particularly Australia, were still sort of controlling immigration based on ethnic groups. So we're just going to do a target. We like this country, we'll do a quota of this. Canada is the first one that said, no, we're just going to have, blind to your origins, etc. If you can do these things for us, you're willing to come in, have shared values, contribute to the economy, and you meet all these benchmarks, you can come in. So the door is open to the entire world. And once you get in, we've got some things we expect of you, but you are going to turn into a Canadian, and Canada is going to absorb you. And Canada did do that very well, which I think sort of led to our naivete and complacency when it comes to these sort of anti-Israel protests have been quite shocking to people, because we thought, these can happen in France, these can happen in the UK, these can happen anywhere except Canada, because we don't import foreign hatreds into Canada. And I think over the last 10, 15 years, it's been a lack of respect for the fact that we were a pluralistic, tolerant, peaceful society, because there was very good management behind the scenes ensuring that would happen. And we thought we could take out all of those controls and not have any consequences. And I've seen that in other aspects of Canadian life. I thought the Canadian firearm system, the way we regulated firearms, particularly as compared to the United States, was really a point of national pride. And what we did, rather than sort of controlling for individual firearms, which is what we're doing now, this is why it's so hard for me to see, we had very good screening. So all of these sort of mass shootings that happen in the US, every time one happens, I would sort of look at the details and say, this wouldn't have happened in Canada. There would have been an intervention. The RCMP have much more power to sort of take firearms from someone. There's much more screening process. To get a gun license, you actually have to go through a course, go through certain checks. You have to fill in a form of all your ex-girlfriends, and they have to say whether you're able to sort of own a firearm. And when I got certified for a firearm, at the end of it, I was like, I like living in a country that can be a well-armed society. We have more guns per capita than is typical for a Western nation, but in which we take pride in owning them responsibly and sort of avoiding the semi-anarchy of the United States. And then you had a government come in and just pay no heed or respect to any of those controls and just pursue American-style gun bans. That's having no effect. And just a complete lack of respect for what was working and what was working well.
Yeah, see, because in your third chapter where you talk about real estate, right? At the end of the day, just recently I covered a paper from the Aristotle Foundation on immigration and housing prices, and the correlation. I mean, it's just obvious that you have a capacity of 230,000 houses a year, and you're letting in 500,000 a year in the last 5 years. What do you think was going to happen? Like,
yeah, it's basic math.
I mean, the problem is, whether it's immigration, whether it's the housing bubble, Tristan, these are good policies. The problem is when the corruption comes in and identity politics starts affecting everything. Because, hey, if I appease to these people, and these people are in the immigration business, I'm the brown guy saying it, ladies and gentlemen, you may not like it, come at the brown guy, which is why the brown man has to do the talking here. This is identity politics. We all know who run immigration. We know the business owners. We know most of them. All right. And these things happen in Punjab. And again, I'm saying it, not trusted. I am saying it because somebody has to.
Which is a going theme, and this sort of comes up in the book, is a lot of these issues are called out, by recent immigrants or sort of, so-called marginalized groups. Which is ironic because you have a bunch of white people who look like me saying, oh, this is what's good for the, indigenous people. This is what's good for the brown people. This is what's good for the marginalized. And often it's members of these groups saying, no, you are pushing policies that are really screwing us. They're screwing over everyone, but you're particularly screwing over us in our name, which makes it hurt even more.
Go ask anyone who's moved to Canada 10 years ago, Tristan, do they want mass immigration?
Oh, I don't have this. I can't do it because I don't have this kind of time. Oh, they'll talk my ear off for 3 hours.
They hate mass immigration. All my friends hate mass immigration. All of them.
Even recently,
we go to Brampton, Mississauga, Abbotsford.
With the 1.2 million we were bringing in per year. I mean, these people were entering Canada because the standard route was you got a temporary foreign worker job, and that was your path to permanent residency. But when you bring in 1.2 million temporary immigrants in a year, there's no way they can get permanent residency. So you have all these people who spent a lot of money to come here, are working at Tim Hortons for not great wages, and now the government's telling them to go home. So they're saying, I was on the path to become a Canadian, and now I find out I was just treated as an underclass without full civil rights, and now you're sending me home? That's not a good feeling as something we did as a country. So, throughout this book, I was surprised when you sort of probe who is against this. It's quite a lot of the so-called marginalized groups who are often the most vociferous against these kind of policies because they're not hurting the fifth generation homeowner with family wealth. They don't have to see these things. It is recent immigrants, it's native groups, it's whatever, getting hit hardest by bad ideas.
What bothers me in this entire process is that it's obviously corruption. It's in your face corruption. And and the tragedy is that it cuts across the political landscape of Canada. The shocker for me in my analysis of Canadian politics is, and I don't hold my punches back because I don't care. Like I once sat down and I told this to a Khalistani. I was like, worst case scenario, you convince some Canadian politics member, politician, to deport me back to India. Look at me. Do I look sad that I'm going back to India? I was like, I'm going back to India.
Yeah,
That's
I
my
own a
home.
house. Yeah.
Yeah, I own a house. I'm freaking recording this podcast, getting up early in the morning because I love Canada and I care for Canada and I live in both countries. I was like, so that's not going to work on me as a threat. Go back to India. Happy to go
And
back to
I
India.
should point out, when people keep saying I can't do that, I've called Northern England and they are not taking me back. So I have nowhere else to go. I'm screwed if this place
Yeah.
goes wrong.
But the weaponization of Canadian niceness, and again, I want to say this. I'm going to say this on behalf, because I say this with a lot of pride. I'm someone who was blessed to have a good life. I made it, I made it in my life as a successful entrepreneur. I've traveled around the world. I've gone to Australia, not gone to New Zealand. I want to go there. Stayed in America multiple times, gone to, Western Europe, United Kingdom, a lot of places. I have barely come across nicer people than Canadians. They are truly some of the nicest people you meet. And to see nice people being taken advantage of by free riders, the skyrocketing of fake homosexual claims in Canada under under
Oh,
refugee
you're talking
claims.
about sort of dubious gender
Yeah,
ID claims. Yeah.
suddenly people are homosexuals, and because they were homosexual, uh you know they were under pressure in India. Give me a freaking break.
Oh, you're
And
talking
and
about
this,
immigration cases,
yeah, immigration
right? Which
refugee
I don't
claim.
touch on in the book, but yeah, I have heard about
Yeah,
this.
I
Yeah.
know. I'm just saying it. And the same. And I was talking
I
to
have
one other friend.
suggested this, in sort of barroom talk with gay friends. I can think of a few very effective tests, to see if they're, uh, actually serious about this. Anyway,
Yes,
no
we
one's
need to
answered my
test them.
calls at the Department of Immigration. Yeah, I have some ideas.
So imagine the fake refugee claims that I could study when I was doing my investigation on refugees. All right. Look, India has problems, but it's not a hellhole. Okay. I am a living proof of that. I live in both countries. I live freely. I talk freely. I criticize Indian politicians. I criticize Canadian politicians. There are problems in India, but the world has not broken down in India. I have seen refugee claims of, let's say, there are 3, 4 major political outfits. So the outfit X, right? This guy writes, I was a member of outfit X. Members of outfit B were after my life. I need refuge in Canada. I'm like, give me a break. You're claiming refugee status using such phony excuses in Canada. And you know what the irony is? The Canadian system
I'm
fell for it.
actually impressed they did that much research, because the people crossing at Roxham Road, they weren't even claiming to be oppressed. You would just come across and you say, I'm seeking asylum, and what for? And
It's
your hearing doesn't
ridiculous.
come up for 3 years, so you're in Canada, and you can get a work permit, you have free healthcare. It's a great deal. And even if you get deported at the end of it, you've had 3 years as a Canadian with full benefits, extra benefits. Actually, as a asylum claimant, you actually have more. I think you had healthcare access even before that was sort of a normal thing across the. Anyway,
Yeah.
go on.
But in your in your real estate chapter, you actually touch upon a few policy problems in terms of how policies are creating roadblocks in the number of houses Canada produces, right?
Right.
Now, can you talk about that? Because in this entire noise on immigration pressure on the housing crisis, we actually don't talk about the major problem is, why is housing construction so slow in Canada?
Yeah. So it's because we have a housing shortage, and we've had a housing shortage for about 20 years, and it's just become exacerbated. So it's only gotten sort of crazy, cuckoo, cartoonish bananas, with crazy amounts of immigration over the past 3 years. But we already had these existing problems, and yeah, it's simply because it is very hard to build a home in Canada. So the classic example is, I don't have the actual dollar figure in front of me, But just the cost of permitting for a home in Toronto is equivalent to what the entire home would cost, as recently as the 1980s. So in all these different aspects, so, just in terms of zoning codes, most of Toronto, most of Vancouver, the two most unaffordable real estate markets on the entire planet, still most of those cities are zoned for single family housing. So there's only very narrow corridors where you can build multi-unit housing. So, I mean, presumably, if we went back in time 10 years and we just loosened all the building codes, cut permitting, not by dramatic amounts, but just to the point where, it would be easy to take a single lot and turn that into a sixplex. That would be, rather than just being an obscene, building codes and, delays and permitting fees, etc. If we just sort of did that, you could see a Canada in which we sort of organically built our way out of the housing crisis over time. But whether it's environmental policy making it more expensive to build homes, whether it's cities constraining where homes can be built, whether it's density regulations, we've essentially just made thousands upon thousands of decisions in which, on the one hand, you're going to make it harder to build homes and the housing shortage is going to get worse. But on the other hand, you got some other stuff that you might want to do other way. And that can range from, we want to have a green belt around Toronto, in which the suburbs don't spread, or we want to have tighter building codes, or we want tighter building envelopes, and it's essentially we just took housing for granted or didn't see it as something that was important, where the availability of housing was always secondary priority. It just was never considered in how we address things, and that extends to we've got a money laundering problem. If we prosecute it, that gets more money out of the real estate market, thus making it more affordable. Let's just kind of ignore it and push it off to the side. So it's just everything. There's so many contributors to the housing crisis, but the one unifying factor is you just had no one saying, actually, for a change, we should make the decision that makes it easier to buy houses and easier to afford them. That was never the option. And I think the system has reacted as you would expect. It's just an exacerbated housing crisis. And then when you talk about corruption, there's not a lot of sort of evil, villainous figures who are like, oh, sure, I'll create a housing crisis. My home equity will go up. But 70% of Canadians are homeowners. The worse this crisis gets, the more their home equity goes up. They get richer. At the steep expense of people who were not in the housing market. But you can call it sort of a demographic corruption in which the homeowning class has no incentive to change a clearly broken system because they happen to be benefiting from it quite handsomely.
Yeah, I agree. Before we wrap up, I have to read this bit from your last chapter, where you say Canada's less open society can probably best be summed up by the text of its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which opens with a warning to Canadians that any freedom can be curbed. Section 2 guarantees freedom of expression, but Section 1 notes that this freedom is subject to, quote, reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And Canadian government agencies are quite comfortable in outlining their view that speech is a thing best controlled. I'll tell you why it hit me so much is, as an Indian and as someone who studies two constitutions, Indians and Canadian, both, we have something called the First Amendment in India, where something like this was added by the first Prime Minister of India, where he added free speech subject to reasonable restrictions, never defined. And then there is a clause B, subject to decency and morality. What is decent? What is moral? Never defined. Canada and India are so similar in the authoritarian concept creep that we have in our body politic. And this is something I always say. America might have many flaws, but the American First Amendment is something that humanity should celebrate. That country
and it's so
has
rare.
somehow
Just
managed
just
it.
those hard rules of screw you, free speech, up yours forever,
Yes.
which is a very American trait and is very rare because most countries do not have that.
Yeah, and Canada certainly does not have it. Can I honestly say this? When I read the last chapter of this book, I have to appreciate you on the podcast. It was beautifully written. I just love that
Thank
chapter.
you.
That's my favorite chapter of the book. I really enjoy. And this, to me, as an Indian who studies Indian law, who has a philosophy background, it hit me so much. I'm like, gosh, Canada and India are so freaking authoritarian in this, and there's this tendency. But my question is, what do we do as Canadians? I consider myself someone who lives there to be a Canadian, part of the Canadian experience, albeit for 7 months. But what do we do to talk to Canadians about this is not cool? The kind of curbs we have on freedom in Canada, whether it's the online hate bill, which they are trying to bring in again, and many other bills that I've tried to cover on the podcast. So, how do we control it?
I think it starts with just a generalized sense that it's not unpatriotic to note flaws in your country and to, even say radical things that, Canada is broken, because you can't, you just think of your family members, someone you love. If they've got a drinking problem, you're probably going to bring this up and tell them to drink less. This isn't going to be seen as, unpatriotic to the family that you're mentioning their drinking problem. So I think the first step is just lots of Canadians have to be comfortable with the idea that we are a country like any other, and we can have corruption, we can have bad ideas, we can have bad actors within the system, and we can have a healthcare system that is not the world's best anymore, maybe never was, and is in need of serious reform. So any of these sacred cows that you have, can't touch that. This is something we don't do in Canada. You have to be sort of comfortable with getting rid of those, because we are stuck in a rut and we have to get out of that rut. And it starts with acknowledging the mistakes we've made. And I think, there's a way you can sort of sell that. And I think a lot of people have told me this book is depressing. I actually felt good at the end of it after writing it, because I thought these are all problems. We did all of this to ourselves. So when you look at major problems faced by other countries, be that hostile neighbors, poor geography, lack of, natural resources, all of these usual things that sort of stop a country from being successful, Canada has none of those. All we have is we keep punching ourselves in the nuts. And this is sort of a portrait of how we are doing that in a variety of ways. And if you are punching yourself in the nuts and you have a full understanding of that, you can learn how to stop punching yourself in the nuts, and it can be a better country for everyone. People ask me how we can fix this, and I just ask you to be more active citizens and also take pride in what Canada has done well. I think with a lot of these failures, I have a renewed appreciation for what was good about Canada. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, I'd say, we don't have a culture here in Canada. There's nothing special about us. We're not unique. But I got to say, when you're seeing people dressed up with masks on their face, having anti-Israel protests in the streets, screaming, lighting off smoke bombs, I'm thinking, oh, actually, what I really like about Canada, that we didn't have stuff like this. This was, there's any number of those. So I think I do see sort of a movement towards that. It starts with waving a Canadian flag, but I think you really need to sit down and realize it was a bad thing to sort of convince yourself that we were a horrible racist place, and merely looking at the maple leaf was a bad thing to do, because there is something special about it, and it's very narcissistic for you to sit there and say, "Oh, Canada is a really crappy place, and we shouldn't celebrate ourselves," because there's any number of people around the world who would be happy to tell you what an asshole you were for saying that, because clearly it's a nice place, and you should maintain your nice place rather than letting it go to shit.
Yeah, I had a hearty laugh when you when you talk about the gay porn channel Male Flakes that was threatened by the regulators.
If I can explain, this is we have
do.
Canadian content rules in Canada. I think are real dumb, and I could do an entire podcast on all the bad media we've gotten out of this. But there is a gay porn channel that they were written up by the CRTC, and they said there's not enough Canadian. They had to have 60% Canadian content, and they said, "Oh my God, how are we going to fill 14 hours a day of Canadian gay porn?" So if you were watching, I've never seen the channel, but if you watched it, it was just the same sort of six guys over and over and over again, and they're like, we can only sell, the same Canadian gay guys over and over again. It's, we need a bit of switching up. So there's any number of those. Actually, if you can, I didn't bring it up in the book, but Canadian content, or maybe I did. The worst sitcom of all time, the worst English language sitcom, is called The Trouble with Tracy. I think there's been reviewers who have said it's the worst. And this is a Canadian sitcom, and this was made purely to meet Canadian content quotas. So I think CTV, when they brought in the first Canadian content quotas, you got to have this much Canadian content, this percentage of the directors, etc., have to be Canadian. They said, okay, screw you. We're going to spend as little money as possible. We're just going to crank out a bunch of schlock, and that's going to fill our Canadian content quota. So you can find clips of it on YouTube, and it's aggressively bad. And there's any number of equally aggressively bad culture that has been pushed out under the Canadian content system.
Yeah, but
of which this podcast, all we've done is talk about Canada. It's two guys in Canada speaking about Canada. I don't think this would qualify as Canadian content because you're not a citizen. So they would say, no, this gets downvoted, not Canadian content. And so it's a dumb system.
It's a dumb system. Not only that, the way they are regulating social media. What was that? Bill 11? It's the 11 or something. The way.
Well, you can't share news on Facebook. That's probably one of the most noticeable things.
Yeah, it's just the way the Canadian politicians try to interfere in people's lives is actually Indians can relate to it. Because India is exactly like that.
There's a lot of, when I mentioned sort of people, other foreign media noticing it, there's a lot of Indian media writing about Canada. And I think it's because Indian media has sort of figured out we're cousins we're doing kind of the same dumb things all at the same time. So I think a lot of, I can only read the English language Indian media. But yeah, I think the Times of India, I think they've started covering Canada because they're like, oh, this is a preview of coming attractions. If Canada's doing it, it's going to be some dumb thing we're going to do in 10 or 15 years.
You know what it is? So because I have so many friends in the Indian media now, just because of the profession I'm in, so they always talk to me. And then like anything happens in Canada, I'm the guy they call usually. All the media houses in India, they will call me, hey, what's happening? And I just keep telling them, I was like, you guys should actually live in Canada. It's just cleaner India in terms of law and everything else, because it's so similar, Canada and India, in the constitutional system. Both countries are top-down authoritarian. Both love the government. Canadians love the government. Yes. Indians love the government. And the fundamental trust on the government system in both these countries is so nauseating for me as someone who has a fundamental mistrust of the government. It's fascinating. And both countries are the same. Also, both countries have the nicest people. Very nice people. Very kind people.
They're very nice.
Very sweet people. So, but Tristin, I had a great time reading this book. I know a lot of people are going to be criticizing you simply for pointing out the obvious, but when I actually read the name of your book, it's a very short book. So I just finished it in like 4 or 5 hours, just straight through it. It was not a lot of time, so it was fine.
The publisher said that. He said, people are impatient these days. It's going to be an easy and readable book. So there's still a lot in there. I jammed it all in, but I made it so it was an easy read because I want everybody to be able to read it. And I also wanted, ideally, we stop doing dumb things, and this is just a time capsule. And, in 20 years from now, read Tristin Hopper's book. It was so crazy back then. And we can sort of look back on this time and laugh at a certain point. So that is my dear hope for this book. Because other countries have gone through periods where just everything sucks and they kind of get their way out of it. Canada hasn't really had a sustained period of just cultural and economic and social decline before. So, speak to your local Argentinian, your local Brit. This is all very familiar to them. But Canadians, it's been all the way up since 1867 until now. So this is all very, very new to us.
Yeah. Well, Tristin, once again, thanks for coming. It was fun chatting with you, and I
have a new appreciation of Indo-Canadian relations. This has been a life-changing experience for me. Thank you.
Yeah, now, and that appreciation will go once you go to Brampton.
Yes.
All right, guys, we'll wrap today's discussion up. But before I wrap it up, once again, I want to remind people that the book is also available in Kindle India. So if you are in India and you want to read this book, you can go buy it. So the link to buy the book is going to be there in the description of the podcast itself. Whether you're watching this on Facebook, on YouTube, wherever you're watching it, or you're listening to it on Spotify, go buy this book. It's a wonderful book. I actually had a lot of fun reading it, and it was a good timely book. Especially Indians are really interested in Canada, so I think I would recommend all of you to read it. And if you, even if you're some Indian living in India, the reason this book helps you is that what we can learn from Canadian mistakes and maybe not do them in
Oh
India
yeah,
at a
this is our
policy
greatest
level.
service since the insulin. Inventing insulin for diabetes. That we've done all these dumb things, so you don't have to. So we've just been a petri dish for dumb things, and just learn from us, and you don't have to do it.
Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned, guys, this podcast runs on only members. I don't even do ad reads on this podcast.
Wow.
So if you can go join the membership program of this podcast. You can also buy my book, Nastic, and you can send one-time donations if you are in Canada through Interac Canada. The email ID is kushalmehra81@gmail.com. In India, the UPI ID is kushalmehra@ICICI. If you can't do anything, just like this video, subscribe to the channel,
Now,
and I'll
give
see
this
you next
just
time.
read that in there. That's on Wilfrid Laurier. Okay, thank you.
All right, guys, take care. Bye-bye. Have a good time.